This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hello and welcome to Daughterhood, the podcast. I am your host, Roseanne Corcoran, Daughterhood Circle Leader and primary caregiver. Daughterhood is the creation of Ann Tumlinson, who has worked on the front lines in the healthcare field for many years and has seen the multitude of challenges caregivers face. Our mission is to support and build confidence in women who are managing their parents' care. Daughterhood is what happens when we put our lives on hold to take care of our parents. We recognize this care is too much for one person to handle alone. We want to help you see your efforts are not only good enough, they are actually heroic. Our podcast goal is to bring you some insight into navigating the healthcare system, provide resources for you as a caregiver, as well as for you as a person, and help you know that you don't have to endure this on your own. Join me in Daughterhood. Dementia. While we know it's a progressive neurodevelopmental condition with over 200 types, there are still many questions of why and how it develops. Today, my guest is Mitchell Clionsky, a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist with 45 years of experience evaluating and treating patients with cognitive impairment, dementia, ADHD, and traumatic brain injury. Dr. Clionsky, along with his wife and partner, Dr. Emily Clionsky, have treated more than 25,000 patients with cognitive impairment. They have taken their experience and research and combined it with the most current scientific findings to create their new book, Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain, a practical guide that empowers you to improve your brain's future. We cover a lot of topics today: our genes, common health issues, sleep, hearing, our habits, and the lifestyle changes we can make to support ourselves and our brains. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Dr. Clionsky, there's so much to cover, but can you shed some light on the confusion around family history and dementia?
It is a complex kind of answer. Let me try to break it down into a couple pieces. There are some families that have very high rates of dementia, of neurologically caused progressive declines in how we think and behave. That's what dementias really are. They're a neurological condition of which Alzheimer's is a big part, but not exclusively. There's a lot involved with vascular factors, circulation, essentially, diabetes and hypertension related to that. There's also Parkinson's disease. There's frontotemporal dementias. Happy to talk about those. Some of them, like Huntington's disease, for example, have a very high genetic loading. 50% of the people who have Huntington's, children of Huntington's patients, will have Huntington's disease, and it's knowable through a genetic test. There are certain kinds of early onset Alzheimer's patterns, usually in very isolated places where there's a lot of familial, I hate the word inbreeding, but it's, you're married to your cousin who is also your uncle. And, there's a lot of those things in places where geographically people are sort of locked in. Those cases, it's very easy to see the genetic pattern, and they start in their oftentimes 40s or 50s. So how do you know if you're one of those people? Well, chances are you don't have any grandparents because they've all had dementia. And then there's the somewhat greater likelihood when you have parents, especially both parents, and they have a higher probability because of the number of their siblings, their brothers and sisters, who also have dementia. And those can be inherited. On the other hand, for most people, dementias are not so much genetic. Maybe 5% of the likelihood is based on who your parents were. The other important thing to know is that even if you have that higher genetic loading, and even if you actually are developing dementia, there's a lot of things you can do to reduce the progression of that and to limit its impact on your life. So when people say, should I get a blood test? Because that's a big rage these days. Everyone's talking about blood tests. In fact, there was a company that was doing blood tests for this direct to the public, Quest Diagnostics. They've recently pulled back on this, partly because of there were some errors technically, I think, and also because there's real questions about what to do when you give a blood test to somebody and there's no follow-up to discuss what that means and how do you deal with it. But there's some people who really want to know that probability. My contention is that doesn't really change very much. You still want to do everything you can to reduce your risk, whether or not you have that gene. It's not like you're going to walk faster when you're walking or that you're going to sleep deeper when you're sleeping. There's really nothing more that you're going to do. Oh, gee, now I'm going to really watch out and not get a concussion because I got that genetic background. No, that's not going to change anything. So I'm not really, I don't recommend it for my patients, and I don't recommend it for their families either, because I don't think it gives us much at this point in time. Now, in the future, if there are earlier interventions medically that make a difference, absolutely. Then you can do something. It becomes actionable information.
And right now, we don't have that.
Correct.
Everything that is out there right now is pretty much minimal gain, if any gain, and it just kind of slows it down for maybe 3 to 5 months.
Well, it depends how you look at it. Let me break that down a little bit.
Yeah.
There's right now, in the last half year, an infusion therapy called lecanemab. Brand name is Leqembi, where people every couple of weeks go in and get this IV infusion into their veins. And they've looked at this over 18 months and show that it probably, you could estimate it maybe over that 18 months reduces the progression by about 3 months. And that may be the figure that you were citing.
Right.
And so if we take that data and we give it the most optimistic kind of interpretation, we would say, well, if we did that in 18 months, maybe in 3 years, we would now slow it down by a half a year. And then maybe over another 3 years, we'd gain another half a year. But that's not been proven. We haven't actually tested it that far. We don't know. It could be that the effect becomes more pronounced, that you get better results. Or conversely, it could be that the early results don't get any better or even get worse. What we're doing with that kind of a treatment is removing beta amyloid plaques, these buildups of these fibrils, little fibers that form into plaques that are sort of cholesterol-like in nature. And they gum up the works, essentially, and also cause a breakdown of the structure of our brain cells called neurofibrillary tangles. But now the thought is, well, if we could find it then, if we go back earlier by doing blood tests and say 10 years before someone becomes symptomatic, and if we catch the very beginnings of the beta amyloid buildup of that point, before anyone's having really any symptoms, if we get rid of the beta amyloid then, we could avoid the disease later. That is really speculative. It's really unclear in my mind. I've only been doing this for 45 years, but it's really unclear in my mind that getting rid of the amyloid at that point will, in fact, change the course of the disease. We don't know what causes Alzheimer's, let alone some of the other ones. Because there are these plaques, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the plaques that are the problem. The plaques may very well be the result of other inflammatory problems, other kind of health changes. For all we know, we could actually need those plaques. And starting to take them away 10 years before we're symptomatic may actually have the opposite effect of what we're intending. On the other hand, we have had medications on the market now for the past 25 years. Three of those medicines work on a particular chemical in our brain called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a chemical which transfers information from one nerve cell to the nerve cells around it. So it's very much involved in the making of new memories. As we get older, our levels of acetylcholine naturally decline. Well, we can't put in more acetylcholine. So what we do is instead help to support the available and existing levels of acetylcholine because that will keep our brains working better longer. That actually does work, and especially in many cases if it's combined with a different kind of medication called memantine, used to be called Namenda. And if we could get people on a combination of those two medications, many of my patients are no different 5 years later than when they walked in the door. Now, I consider that in an aging population to be a really good outcome.
That's a win.
So we've had this for a long time, but people got confused because taking these acetylcholine medications like Aricept, otherwise prescribed as donepezil, Exelon, which is now prescribed as rivastigmine, Razidine, which is prescribed as galantamine, don't make you better by themselves. And because they don't make you better, oftentimes people conclude that they don't have much benefit. Well, in a condition that by its very nature gets worse over time, no news is good news. So I'm very pro existing medications because I see it all the time where people come in and I see them every 6 months or every year. And over a course of time, they're very stable.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good outcome.
That is a good outcome. And that's with the combo of the Aricept and the Namenda.
Yes.
Okay. That's very interesting.
One of the other things that we found is if you can discover other conditions, medical conditions or lifestyle problems, and improve those, sometimes people get better by about 15% and stay better over a much longer period of time. So my wife, the psychiatrist Emily Clionsky, and I did a study back in the early, it was 2010 is when we started the study. We eventually presented it at the American Academy of Neurology in Philadelphia in 2014. In the study, we followed 750 people, patients of ours, all of whom were seen by me for testing. I'm a neuropsychologist, so my primary role is to perform cognitive tests, along with my postdocs and my testing assistants. At that point in time, I was seeing anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 people a year. I've cut down in my later years. I only see about 600 to 700 people a year now, but it's still a darn lot. It's a lot of people.
That's a lot.
And our goal is to test their abilities to pay attention, their abilities to learn and remember new information, short-term memory, to solve problems, to think abstractly. We basically create an inventory of their cognitive abilities, take stock of their thinking skills. Well, we followed all of these people, these 700 people, for 2 years at 6-month intervals. Half of those people were patients that Emily did not see in her practice. They were being followed by neurologists and primary care doctors in the community. The other half, she was seeing as their primary dementia doctors. And these were people who ranged anywhere from having mild cognitive impairment, which is a level below their normal level, but not yet to the point of dementia. So they were just having inefficiencies, greater difficulty in thinking, but they're really at risk for decline. So we started with people at that level, anywhere down to a level of mild to moderate dementias of all types. So there's Alzheimer's and vascular and lots of combinations of these. Big difference was her group got a lot more attention. They got blood tests for things that their traditional doctors were not testing. They had overnight sleep studies that looked at their oxygen levels and the number of times they stopped breathing during the night. They were put on usually combined treatment with the cholinesterase medicines and Namenda, but also were the people from my group. Mostly I was getting the doctors to do that part of it. But Emily's focus was fixing all the underlying medical conditions as well as treating them with the medicines. And what we found out was that 6 months into this, her half of the sample was about 15% better. My half of the sample was slightly worse than when they first started, just slightly. 6 months after that, so we're now at a year, her group was still 15% better. My group was now a step down. They were about 10% worse. These were significant statistically from the very first 6 months. A year after that, so 2 years out from the starting point, there was even more rapid change and difference because her group was the same. My group got significantly worse because they were just being treated mostly by the medications. When we looked at the data subsequent to our presentation at the Academy, we started drilling down on where was this coming from. What we discovered was that the biggest part of what made the difference was the fact that she was treating the sleep apnea as well as prescribing the medications. So her patients were getting more oxygen to their brain.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that sleep apnea and oxygen are actually the secret sauce for a lot of this. And it's amazing to me that none of the current drug companies are actually testing anyone in their study groups to see who's got sleep apnea. They're just ignoring this whole factor.
Yeah. And believe me, when I finished your book, I was like, I'm getting a sleep study.
Did you end up doing it?
Not yet. Well, not yet. That's the flip side of everything, right? You have to call to make the appointment, and you have to wait for your appointment, then you have to have the consultation for your appointment, then you have to make the appointment for the sleep. So we'll get there, but it's
like an odyssey. Unnecessarily, you can actually go up to a website and order a home sleep study today. It'll be there in a couple days. It'll be then read by a board certified sleep medicine doctor, and it'll cost $250 to do this.
Yeah.
It can be done under our insurance system, but usually it's not.
Why? Let's not be crazy now, right? We don't want to support these things.
I want to give people care. I mean, really, what are we doing here?
Yeah. And that when I read that, I was like, oh my goodness, because, there are times when you wake up and you feel like, did I sleep? And for caregivers, sleep is a premium. Sleep isn't guaranteed. Good sleep is never guaranteed. And it's hard. And then to think, well, now I have to go get a sleep study. I'm never going to get a sleep study. I'm lucky I can get out when I get out. Having that ability to get it at home would be great.
And they're just as accurate by and large. There are some particular kinds of sleep conditions where after the home sleep study, they want you to come into a lab because they want to figure out exactly what kind of sleep apnea you have and what's the best way to treat it. But as a starting point, if I ruled the world at age 50, everyone would start getting a colonoscopy, all the women would get mammograms, and everybody would get a home sleep study. Since we published the book just about 3 or 4 months ago, there was a very interesting study that was done looking at 6,000 people from the general population who were middle-aged or older. This was done through a consortium of the kinds of study centers like the Framingham Heart Study, where in Framingham, Massachusetts, they've been doing this for years. They bring in a cohort of people, middle-aged or older. They give them a whole bunch of different tests, and then they follow them every 3 to 5 years with additional tests. Well, it turns out there's like 6 or 7 places like that in the country, which all banded together and then gave every single one of their people, 6,000 of their newest enrollees, a one-night sleep study.
Mm-hmm.
Out of these 6,000 people, 50% had sleep apnea. That's how common it is. And yet, the rate of diagnosis is so much lower than that because we're still back in the age of thinking you have to be a male, you have to be fat, you have to snore terribly, and you have to sit down in front of the TV and fall asleep immediately in order for us to give you a sleep study. And that's what that consult is all about. It's a stupid consult.
Yep.
It determines whether or not you're going to get the test, but they're not going to really make the determination unless you get the test. So why are we doing this consult? I don't get it.
I don't either. It's infuriating. But then is the only way, if you have sleep apnea, to wear the mask?
It is the best way. So this is an interesting point because I was talking about it with somebody else the other day, and I had to go back and pull up 4 studies on this. So the most effective treatment, the thing that will reduce your level of sleep apnea down to less than 1 or 2 events per hour, rather than being 5 to 30 or 40, depending on the severity, is continuous positive airway pressure, CPAP. So CPAP works by the principle that air is a fluid, and that if you put air under pressure and you put it so that you're breathing it under pressure, it keeps your throat open, it keeps your airway open so it doesn't collapse or become obstructed. In the same way that you have a garden hose that collapses when you don't have water running through it, turn on the water, suddenly it's a fully functional hose. The same thing happens with air, regular room air that's put under pressure, goes through this flexible tube to a mask. Now, over the course of years, and by the way, I'll tell you, I've been on a CPAP every night for the last 18 years. And I've seen so many people who have used this. I know a lot about it through experience of various natures. The technique has gotten better. The machines have gotten lighter and quieter to the point where you can hardly even hear them now. So you don't have to worry about keeping your bed partner awake. They also have a variety of different masks that are much smaller and more efficient than we used to have. There's some commercials you may have seen on TV for a technique or a device called Inspire. They don't tell you it's a surgical implantation like a pacemaker for your throat, that it's only approved for moderate to severe sleep apnea. So these are people who are basically not breathing 20 or more times per hour. They also don't tell you that that little device that looks like it's the remote control for your bedroom fan that you sort of lay on top of your chest or next to you while you sleep is only the outside part. That it's not the inside part.
Mm-hmm.
We find that if we can get people to approach this in a more positive kind of way, we give them a lot of support early in the process, that not only do they get used to this, but it really works for them and is something they don't want to give up later on. There's another type of device. It's called a mandibular advancement device. It's a dental type of thing that moves your jaw forward. And for people who absolutely cannot and will not use a CPAP, I'll tell them to go and get one of these dental devices. The reason I'm not so excited to hop on top of this is that it's only half as effective as the CPAP. So if you have somebody who's got more than 10 events per hour where they stop breathing or their oxygen level drops by 4%,
Mm-hmm.
instead of it taking you down like the CPAP will to about 2 events per hour, this will take you down to about 5 or 6.
Okay.
Well, you've still got sleep apnea because anything over 5 is sleep apnea.
Yeah.
And the rationalization that's given is that, well, we can't get people to use CPAP well enough. So they'll only use it maybe 40% of the time. Therefore, even though this is only half as good, if they're using it all the time, it nets out at the same point. I believe that we're making a mistake by approaching it that way. I think we should be spending much more time explaining to people why this is important, helping them to get comfortable using it, essentially how we would for anything that's new and different, and that you have to just sort of figure it out and use it on a regular basis. So I think our energies would be far better spent putting it into something that really works well than saying, well, this is almost as good. Let's use this because you're more likely to use it.
Right. And does like lifting your bed up help at all?
Yeah.
Will that help?
Yeah. I have people usually buy a bed wedge
Okay. Yeah.
because they can put something under the head of their bed, under the legs of that part of the bed. And that'll help a little bit getting a foam bed wedge, or if they really want to spend a little money, getting a Tempur-Pedic bed wedge, gives them more support on their back. That will help. Both of those are better than just using pillows because, unfortunately, if you're sleeping on your back with a couple pillows under your head, you're probably doing something to your neck that you don't want to do.
Right.
The reason that this can be of some help is that the gravitational force of direct gravity forcing straight down is going to more likely collapse your airway. Whereas if you're on an angle, the gravitational force is a little less direct.
Okay.
It's not usually enough by itself, but it can be a bridging technique.
It's very interesting. And it's, it all goes back to it's not just one thing with dementia. It's not just we're going to do this and it's going to be fixed. There's so many different variables. And can we talk about some of the conditions that affect, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, sedentary lifestyle, smoking, drinking? Like, what are the things that we can control that we could try to change and help ourselves?
Great question. And you're right. In midlife, particularly, diabetes and hypertension are two of the major drivers of later life dementia. They're secondary in many cases to obesity and lack of exercise and smoking. So those factors all work together. So if you're going to change something and you can quit smoking, that's going to help a lot. If you're going to exercise, and by that I mean, 30 minutes of walking a day is great. And especially it can be done by breaking it up into smaller segments. I instruct people to take a 10-minute walk 3 times a day because they can do that and it's less likely they're going to resist it because it's only 10 minutes.
Right.
So if you can get people to get out and it's cumulative, they won't hurt themselves. So we get them moving, we get them to stop smoking, and then we can say, okay, let's take a look at what you're eating. Not so much from the fact of, are you eating these certain fruits or berries? Or is it the green leafy vegetables or whatever? Or is it fish rather than beef? To be honest, the research doesn't show that that makes a big difference. We're Americans. We like to eat our way into health. I don't quite understand it, but it really is true. And if you could open the Dementia Prevention restaurant, I'm sure it would be a hit. I'm probably wasting my time writing books. I should be opening a restaurant. The problem is that stuff doesn't work particularly well. But the amount you eat can make a difference because, like it or not, your body was designed for a certain size. Not to shame anyone, but simply to say that's the way you're built. That's what your body is designed for. If you carry more weight than your body's designed to carry, your body's not going to react very well. It's going to have problems. And that's where you get into the sugar levels being too high, the blood pressure being too high, the fatigue because you're carrying around a backpack essentially all day long. So you're not going to want to go out and do anything. You want to lie down, not socialize, not interact, turn on the TV and space out. Well, that's not going to be good for your brain. So that's really important. One of the things that most people don't know is that hearing loss is a cause for dementia.
Yep, that was my next question.
Getting your hearing tested. So how do you know if you need a hearing test? Well, if you're 70 years old, there's about a 70% chance that you've got hearing loss. Just
Really?
statistically, yeah.
Wow.
So you probably should get it tested. But if you're cranking up the volume on the TV, you've decided that everyone in your world mumbles now, probably should get your hearing tested because it may not be them as much as it's you. I love the story about the guy who calls the doctor and asks, I think my wife is losing her hearing. Can I bring her in? And the doctor says, well, here, I got a test for you. You don't have to bring her in. He says, really? He says, yeah. You start about 20 feet away when her back is turned and ask her what's for dinner. If she doesn't answer, go 5 feet closer. If she doesn't answer, go 5 feet closer. Eventually, you'll figure out how close you have to get for her to answer. So he says, great. I love that idea. So that day, his wife's working in the kitchen. He stands 25 feet away and says, honey, what's for dinner? No response. He walks closer, repeats the question. He walks closer, repeats the question. Finally, standing right behind her, and he says, honey, what's for dinner? She looks around and says, for the 5th time already, we're having chicken. So you never know who's got the hearing loss. Sometimes it's both of you.
It was definitely not her.
So I tell people, go get your hearing tested, but go someplace where they're not also a private place trying to sell you hearing aids. You want someone whose opinion you can objectively believe in because they've got no stake, they've got no horse in the race, as we say.
Right. Is that in your nose and throat, doctor?
Actually, I send people to Costco.
To you?
I do. And
Well, because if they need them, then they're cheaper there too. Yeah.
they actually are the cheapest and best hearing aids. And I hope that people who are listening aren't saying, well, my brother's an audiologist and they're taking business away. I may be, but the reason I do that was because my patients kept coming in to see me and raving about their hearing aids.
How about
And
that?
I thought, this is the strangest thing. People are saying, I love my hearing aids. They used to hate them.
Right.
And they'd all say, you'll never guess where I got them. And it was always Costco. So at this point, I find that if you want to go someplace else, wonderful, get your hearing tested. If you have no place else that you know of, it's free if you're a member of Costco. You just have to make an appointment, and they really do sell very high quality hearing aids.
Well, and that was the big thing that happened last year when the hearing aids were able to be sold over the counter now.
Yes.
For the people that it is cost prohibitive for, they can still get these hearing aids that would help, because I don't think people realize it's the quickest way to dementia. And people just don't want to, I'm not wearing it. It doesn't, I don't want people to see that I have hearing aids in it. It's like, no, it's the bigger picture here.
But also these days, they're so small that
Yeah.
unless you're really up looking in someone's ear, and if you're that close, you know them well enough so that you can do this. But if you're that close, you can't see them. That's the amazing. If you're a woman, you hardly ever see them because they're under your hair.
Your hair. Yeah. Yeah.
If you're a man, you can sometimes see them, but if you've got gray hair, the little wires that come down look about the same color as your hair.
Mhm.
And people say, "Oh, they'll think I'm old." And I say to them, you know what really makes you look old? They say, what? I say, exactly. What? What? That really makes you look old.
Yeah.
If you hear better, you're going to seem younger and more with it. Jokes are going to make more sense. You're going to laugh more. You're going to interact better with other people if nothing else happens. But it turns out there's actually a physical change in the brain in several different areas that occurs when people have hearing loss. Their brains do not get stimulated, and so parts of the surface of their brain actually get thinner.
Hmm.
And the other thing that happens, we found out through a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, is that one of the background networks that connects different parts of our brain is called the salience network. So when something's salient, it means it's meaningful. When people have hearing loss, their salience network gets downregulated and they get pulled back and withdrawn, and they're not finding things interesting enough to actually hold on to and pay attention to.
Mhm.
So we want to change that. We want them to have interest in the world around them. We want the connections between their auditory association cortex on the surface of their brain to connect with the central memory areas, because that's going to help reduce their risk of decline. So that's what, plus they come back to see me, their test scores are better.
Really?
Really.
I believe it. How could they not be?
Well, it's more meaningful. People typically understand the social implications. They say, well, I get it. You're more social. I said, yeah, that's true. And you're also less depressed. Chronic depression is also a risk factor. And the things people do to deal with their chronic depression, they sometimes drink too much alcohol as a way of medicating themselves against their depression.
Mhm.
They also, of course, miss out on a lot of the activities that would keep them cognitively engaged. Some of them get really anxious and then they start taking benzodiazepines, Valium, Librium, lorazepam, Xanax, all these different short acting anti anxiety medications that, if you take them chronically, in other words, for more than 90 days, you actually increase your risk for dementia. A woman I saw just this morning takes 3 times a day a benzodiazepine. She's been doing it for years. I understand she's really depressed and anxious, but this is not the way that's best going to help her with this. It's just going to calm her. There's something to be said for being calm, but not in this way that clouds her thinking.
Right. And that's part of the challenge here, because we know that dementia affects women more than men. And we know that when it comes to caregiving, men caregive. I'm not saying that.
Mhm.
Primarily it's women.
That's right.
So here we are, women at midlife, and we're not sleeping because we're caregiving or we're in menopause, which again is that wild. We don't know. I mean, it's 2024 and nobody can tell us what the best thing to do with menopause is. Are we taking hormones? Are we not taking hormones? Are hormones going to increase your risk? Like the big study that came out in 2023 from Denmark that said it increases your risk of dementia by 24%. And then we have, no, it's really fine, but you can take it. Okay, so we're in this stew. And then when we go to our doctors say, you're just stressed or you're just anxious. And then you get the benzos. So
Mhm.
then you're in this midlife of menopause, sleeplessness, um, high blood pressure, obesity, depression, and anxiety, which isn't being treated because we're being patted on the head and given these benzos,
Yep.
which then affect our cognition, which also makes us feel more depressed and more anxious because we're, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting why I came in this room. What do we do? How do we do this?
You are right. And it's very complex. And you have to figure out where you can intervene. So, one of the things you can do, no matter how busy you are, is you can squeeze in a 10-minute walk and do it a couple times a day. If you're caring for somebody, guess what? They probably also need the exercise. You can start to look for other sources of help for the person you're caring for. One of the things I see time and again in my practice is people who are great children. It's almost like they're too good at being a caregiving child because they believe that it's their duty to do it all. And consequently, they don't take care of themselves. And I preach bringing in other assistance, even if you could do it at that point, because you, number one, you want your parent or loved one to get used to also receiving care from someone else. Number two, you're going to need time to recharge and take care of yourself. Because if you go down, the whole house of cards goes tumbling along with you. So you got to do some self care along the way. You need a break.
Mhm.
You need to be able to go and do something else and talk to some other people or take a class if you wanted to, or just take a walk or just take a nap or whatever it is, that play cards with somebody for a half an hour that gives you some time away. That's a more normal kind of life, because caregiving goes on and on and on and on in many cases. And you're working so hard to keep that person you're caring for healthy that it makes it go even further than if it had the natural course, because you're taking really good care of that person.
Right.
So the question is, who do you have to ask to help you out? How do you say, nope, this is more than I can do by myself, or it's more than I really should do for myself? Because people can really, in the short run, especially, do way too much. But it's not a sprint, it is a marathon. And so you got to pace yourself. And so I really work hard at getting, other people involved. Yeah, there's that brother who lives such and such a way, and he'll, talk to mom on the phone. He needs to actually take mom for a couple weeks. He needs to come in and visit more often and give you a spell. He needs to make some adjustments because you need to share this more. So you got to look around. Then you have to think, can I get some agencies involved? Or do I have the means to also bring in some people where I can afford, or mom can afford to pay for some help? And she might say, I don't want anyone else. And you
Mhm.
have to say, you know, I would love to have me full time too. But
Right.
so do my kids. So does my husband. So do my friends.
Yeah.
So it's a tough thing though, but it really is true. What you're pointing out is absolutely correct.
And it's so hard too, because then, okay, we make it to the doctor, and some of these things I didn't know beta blockers can affect your cognition. So, like, how are you supposed to navigate these things in a positive way for yourself, that you're still taking care of the condition that you have, but you're trying to advocate for yourself with your own doctor and say, I don't think this is going to work for me. Is there something else?
Complicated by the fact that you may not even see your doctor,
Right.
or the amount of time you may see your doctor may be so limited that you had two other problems which are a little more pressing at the time. And by the time you get to the third one, the doctor says, well, I'm sorry, I got to see somebody else.
Right.
Yep. You're talking about systemic problems in the healthcare system. I'm hoping that doing positive things for your health in general reduces some of the need for some of the medications that are so easily prescribed.
Mhm.
There's a big push to deprescribe some things that especially are anticholinergic.
Right.
What I think about is the people who are having a constellation of problems, each of which adds to this. Number one, they have trouble falling asleep. So they take an over-the-counter sleep medication, something with a PM at the end of it that contains diphenhydramine, otherwise known as Benadryl. They also have allergies. So they're taking some medicines to dry themselves up. Chances are those are also anticholinergic. They're probably also in midlife or later experiencing more frequent urination than they would like. The doctor says, oh, I got something here that'll tighten up your bladder. Guess what? It's anticholinergic. It reduces the levels of acetylcholine in your brain, which previously, as we were talking about, we're trying to maintain with those medicines that we use for cognitive decline.
Right.
And then you have the ones that you probably need to take, but could be perhaps switched to something else. So, for example, there may be a heart medicine. There may be an antidepressant. There may be something else that you're taking, which is good for you, but it adds to the other things you're taking. And that's we get into the concept of anticholinergic burden, where it's not just one, it's not just two. You look at it, it's 4 or 5 things you're taking, all of which combined space you out, make it hard for you to think. We don't know that necessarily that will cause you to have dementia at a higher rate, but we do know that you'll feel like you do because you can't find words and you can't remember what you're planning on doing, and finding where you left your keys is now a half-hour project.
Mm-hmm.
So that part of figuring out what you're taking, and that's why we have connection in our book online and also on our website to an anticholinergic burden calculator, where you can very easily type in whatever you're taking, both things that are prescribed and things that you buy on your own, and it will give you a score. That's an accurate score of how anticholinergic is this thing. And you add that up, it'll give you a better idea of what you're taking and where there may be some opportunities to change things.
And that's on your website.
That is, yeah, it's on braindoc.com. And of course, you want to do this with your doctors. Getting back to the thing you asked before, is what happens when you have a doctor who is not responsive?
Yeah.
I think you need to find another doctor, actually. I hate to say it because it's real hard to do that. But there's only so much you're going to persuade your doctor. I mean, maybe they'll read the book. Maybe you give them a book. I had this fantasy that we're going to put a copy of our book into the hands of every medical student in the United States. Thinking, how do we raise enough money to, even at the discounted rate, give 80,000 doctors a book that'll give them insight into, oh, here's some things that are within my control that I wasn't really paying attention to, because, they didn't teach much about dementia when I went to medical school. And even in my continuing education, I don't get a lot of training in dementia. Turns out that something like 40% of the doctors out there are not even comfortable identifying or treating dementia.
No.
The chances are almost 50-50. Your doctor may say, oh, don't worry about that, Roseanne. Everybody your age has that problem. It's pretty normal. That's no big deal.
Right. Which is what they do when we go with our parents.
Yes.
And they say, oh, it's nothing. Oh, it's just aging. And you're like, no, this is not aging. And these are things that need to be addressed, but they don't want, whether by training or they don't have it to be able to say, well, we'll do this, this, and this.
Right.
It's very frustrating. And it's hard because we're trying. And, there's no guarantee when it comes to dementia. I think everybody knows that. And while I was reading your book, I was like, well, boy, this is rough. and then I got to that section of, okay, you can do these things. And it did make me feel hopeful. And like I said, I'm going to get a sleep study, but it did make me feel hopeful because of some of the control that we can take back and at least try and at least do something to try to help yourself.
Well, here's what's really cool about it is, and I agree with you, it is an optimistic message, which is great because I'm a light one candle rather than curse the darkness kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the interrelatedness of so many of these different factors causes them to be worse also can work in the other direction. That if you begin to change one or two things, let's suppose getting back to exercise or to a sleep study where suppose you get sleep study, turns out you have sleep apnea, you really embrace treating that. Now, a couple really cool things happen. Number one, you sleep more continuously. You don't get up 2 or 3 times to go to the bathroom during the night. You get into deeper sleep. Because you're getting more oxygen to your brain's lymphatic system is able to flush out the toxins that have built up during the day while you were thinking so that your brain is clear and you feel better when you wake up. Now, because you have more energy, you say, I can sneak out for 10 minutes, walk before mom wakes up, or before my husband gets up, or before any of these things happen. So I'll start doing this. And I don't feel so hungry. I don't feel like I have to have a Hershey bar in order to pump my energy in the afternoon because I'm fatigued. So I can avoid that. Now your weight starts to normalize more and your sugar levels are more stable. So that one intervention has this fallout effect.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking for, starting someplace.
And that, even if you're caregiving, you can try to supplement something. Even, what do we talk about? We talk about the Mediterranean DASH diets.
Mm-hmm.
Just trying to incorporate something because it just kind of makes you feel better.
Yeah.
And it makes you feel like, okay, I feel a little bit better when I have this instead of having, a scotch and soda and a candy bar.
Don't rain on our parade here, Roseanne.
I'm sorry. I think about that part you have in the book where the woman said to you she has a vodka and seltzer every night to relax. And you were like, okay, and how big is the glass? Like, it's a 16-ounce glass of vodka and seltzer. I'm thinking you're going to be a little woozy.
But it's only one.
But it's only
Only
one,
one.
just one.
I once went to a restaurant where they showed us how they could take this one particular wine glass and put an entire bottle of wine into it. I thought, well, that's really great, except hopefully you're not serving that to people like that. They weren't.
Cow.
But,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's deceiving. We actually posted something on our LinkedIn account where we put 3 standard glasses of wine into a wine glass. And it looks like what a lot of people drink, but it's actually 3 standard servings, was 9 ounces of wine.
Wow. Well, and that's part of it. Like, we're just going along and portion sizes have gotten bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Drink sizes have gotten, like, everything has just gotten bigger. And I don't know if we're realizing that.
Probably not. We don't measure a lot of that stuff. People measure when they're baking, but they oftentimes don't measure in other areas and they just pour.
Right.
And, and I joke with people about it all the time. I said, do you actually take your whiskey and put it through a shot glass, or do you pour like your neuropsychologist pours? And they always laugh and they look at me and I said, yeah, I know. We got to use a shot glass. Otherwise, we're going to be drinking a lot more than we think we are.
Well, yeah, true. Now, what do you say about those? We see the commercials all the time. My memory got better when I took. Are there these quick fixes for our memory out there?
That's what's known as placebo effect.
Okay.
It's otherwise known as Dumbo's feather. Remember the old Walt Disney cartoon with Dumbo, the flying elephant, and he had this feather in his trunk that allowed him to fly. And Jiminy Cricket, who was up in his hat, had to talk him out of it when the feather dropped out of his trunk one day while he was flying and says, it's not the feather, Dumbo, it's you. You're the one who's causing this. So there's a lot of things that people do that make them feel better. And because they're doing something, and here's the interesting thing, it actually does cause endogenous changes in our brain. In other words, you take 2 Tylenol because you have a headache. Before it even hits your stomach, your brain is already sending out endocannabinoids. It turns out it works on the cannabinoid receptor sites in your brain. Same thing marijuana works on. And these are self-propagating kinds of chemicals. And because we're used to getting a good response from the Tylenol, we actually begin to secrete those things, helping us to reduce the pain. Well, for a lot of people, there's a very powerful effect to taking something which they think is going to help them. If it's expensive, the effect works better. What a setup. And it also works, by the way, if you tell the person that there's actually no science behind it, it still works. That's what's so amazing about this. It's called a placebo. There's a negative effect too, called the nocebo effect, where people sometimes, and you may know friends like this, I see patients like this, where they tell me, I nibble a little bit of this pill that my doctor prescribed because if I take it, even at its lower dose, I have horrible side effects. I'm completely sensitive to every medicine that anyone has ever given me. That just doesn't exist. That person's not like that, except that they've made themselves like that. And so they've taken it down to a dose that's so small that it has no effect because that's the only one they can tolerate.
Right.
So the question for us as treating professionals is, how do we use this in a positive way, being respectful to people and saying, I tell people, do you really want to spend $60, $70 a month on this thing, which, maybe jellyfish do have it together, but the evidence is that people don't remember better as a result of taking this. Or else you see the commercials, this is my other pet peeve, where they say, I take this product that they've taken, all these fruits and all these vegetables, they freeze dried them and crammed them into little pills. And because I am active and I take this and I want to stay active, I will keep taking this. Mm-hmm. And they can say that because they're just saying what they're intending to do. But it gives the false impression that it's those pills, those capsules that are actually causing their good health.
Right.
They're not. But they got lots of people who enjoy this. They think that here's one thing I can do. The negative part of this whole message, though, is that that's enough. Yeah. And it isn't. That's where people take the wrong turn because they think, well, I don't have to really pay attention to this or that or the other thing because I'm taking my 3 fruits and my 3 vegetables a day.
Right.
That won't do it.
No. Mm-mm. Are there any that you do? Are there any supplements or vitamin supplements that you like? I mean, we hear a lot about vitamin B and vitamin D and that kind of thing. Is there anything that you like?
If you are deficient,
yeah,
yes.
Okay.
You're vitamin B deficient, taking a B supplement, really great idea. If your vitamin D is even in the low end of normal, you probably will benefit from supplementing it, but you got to be careful. You don't take too much. But this is not the kind of stuff where you just stop by the vitamin counter in the pharmacy and say, oh, it's alphabet soup time. I'll take a B and a D and a C and an E. And pretty soon I've got enough of the alpha. I could write my name with my vitamins.
Right.
Unless you need them, what's most likely to happen, assuming that you don't overdose on it, is that it's most likely just to go right through your body and out the other end. And you've become a very expensive processing plant for the vitamins.
Okay. And what's too much vitamin D?
You want to be at about 50 to 60 or 70 nanograms per milliliter. You don't want to be up in the range of 90 to 100. That's when you start getting problems with your calcium and other areas. Yeah. And this is not my area of great expertise, but I know enough about it that I know that people can get themselves into trouble at those levels. But also, if you're just at the lower end, you're 25 to 30 or 35 nanograms per milliliter, that may not be optimal for your brain or even your pain levels. It's amazing what can happen with some of the aches and pains if you have normal levels of vitamin D. You get those in the normal range, a lot of times those aches and pains improve.
That's great to know. And that, again, comes back to asking your doctor for that blood test.
Right.
So when we go to the doctor and we say we may have a problem, we think we have a problem with our memory, or we have someone who we think has a problem with their memory. Again, it's difficult to breach that, but you have developed a memory screening test.
Yes.
That we could take and then keep it for a year or take it to the doctor and put it as part of our chart. Can you, how did you develop that and how can we access that?
Well, the development took 20 years and this took place initially in my practice as more and more of the time we were testing people on very extensive batteries of tests and then giving them what were the quick tests of the day, most commonly the mini mental state exam. Started back in 1975 by a very brilliant psychiatrist by the name of Marshall Folstein. And what we kept finding was that there was this group of people who did not do well in their tests, but had perfectly normal scores on their MMSEs, their mini mental states. I said, why is that? And we realized that the active ingredients of the MMSE were only a couple little parts of it. And so we took those parts and extracted them. We added some other tests, including a clock drawing test, which you may be familiar with because it's routinely done by neurologists and even some primary care doctors. We added a couple other memory components and we created a test called the Memory Orientation Screening Test, the MOST. It's a 5-minute test. And then we were originally developing it paper and pencil, but then we got the idea to put it on an iPad. so that it could be given reliably and it could be done in a doctor's office. And not only could it be administered by an assistant this way, but then at the end, the score would not only show you what you did, where your level was, but would also print out a page or two of recommendations for the doctor. So they'd have a treatment plan based on the score that they could then choose from.
Mhm.
Well, it was so good that we then went into partnership with a company called Quest Diagnostics, and they bought the rights for the test,
Hmm.
which was wonderful.
Yeah.
They renamed it, and for 5 years they had the exclusive rights, during which time we stopped, by virtue of our contract, promoting this.
Hmm.
And at this point, we're a couple generations behind in the programming for the most. Quest decided not to stay in the testing business, so the rights are back with us. So one of our jobs for 2024 is revitalizing this test and also trying to come up with a version of it that you could do at home with your mom.
Yes.
Because if you have that kind of tool, you can then get a pretty accurate idea of how she's doing without having to rely on just that intuitive sense of, geez, you forgot my name yesterday, but today she seems with it. Should I be worried or not?
Hmm.
This is something that's more reliable over time, that doesn't change so much from day to day. So that's what we're going to be working on. We're being out a year on the book. We were thinking about redoing it or up. It's not quite yet. There hasn't been enough new research that it makes sense to come up with a new edition of it. But we're going to turn our attention to more diagnostic stuff in 2024. Hopefully, have that out within a couple months from now, so that people could get this and use this. Anybody who's looking to follow up with this, stay tuned to our website, because that's when we'll be beginning to announce it. If there's anybody in your listening audience who happens to work for a large corporation and would like to partner on this, that would be ideal, because it's very time consuming
I would
to
think
do
so.
this kind of a thing. And while we have a lot of data, we don't have, there's not 20 of us.
Right. Yep. No, that's great. No, I mean, the work that you've done, you can tell that there's a lot of research, there's a lot of education, there's a lot of heart in this book and in what you're trying to convey, and it's really great. I mean, thank you for that. It's hopeful, and it because dementia's tough, dementia's rough, and we start to look at it and think, oh, well, we're all just going to get this, you know.
Right. And we need to know that 1 out of 2 cases are preventable. And the person you really should thank is my mom, for a couple of different reasons.
Hmm.
Number one, when she came down with dementia, part of me realized that as bad as this was, I was going to learn something from it. That was going to help me to be a better doctor. So she taught me a lot about life, and her life taught me a lot about dementia, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective. The other thing was something she used to say to me when I was real little, and she claimed it was an old Yiddish expression. But to be honest, I've never found anyone else who knows this expression. The expression, though, was, if you can't get over the table, get under the table. I said to her, Mom, what does that mean? She said, well, it means that find a different way to do it. Figure it out. Don't just accept something for what it is. And that has really been a guiding principle, and one that I like to put out there, because I think that one of the big challenges of living is adapting to things that happen. And a lot of people stop adapting once they reach midlife. They think that they're sort of done and that that's all there is. And so it happens. Whatever happens, happens. It's not true. That if you don't keep changing, if you don't keep growing, you're not going to succeed. And so that's really the passion that I feel is, how do I take on the next chapter of my life and those of the people around me? If you take that attitude, I really think you work out better in the end.
I love that. It's very true. And I think that we do get caught in that. Well, just how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You know, we all come up in these family systems, right? So this is what we do. This is what we eat. This is how we live. These are the things that we do. Is it more lifestyle or is it more genetic? And that's that balance, right?
It's both. It can't be
Yeah.
anything but both. But we don't have control over the genes.
Right.
That's the important thing. It's sort of the way it's really, I tell people it's like you do a sculpture out of marble. To some degree, you are limited by the veins in the marble, the imperfections that exist in the stone as it's quarried. That's where you start. Well, if you say, well, gee, I was going to make a tabletop out of this, but there's this curve in this, now you have to say, well, I'm going to have to look for a different thing to make my tabletop, probably, but I could take this and turn it into that. And that's where you start with where it is genetically. You say, how do I make the best of what I've been dealt as a hand, so to speak, card hand? How do I make the best out of this statue? What do I chip away at that I want to work on? That's the job.
That's great. That's hope, right? That's hope.
It is. Yes.
That's hope. Do you have any other advice or anything that you would like to say to someone who is listening?
I want to say thank you to caregivers out there because, it's a mostly underpaid or unpaid and sometimes, unfortunately, thankless kind of job. So for me, I say thank you because you're holding it together.
A big thank you to Dr. Mitchell Clionsky for being my guest today. For more information about Dr. Clionsky, including his book and all of the resources he mentioned today, visit his website, BrainDoc, BrainDoc.com. I hope you enjoyed our podcast today. Head over to daughterhood.org and click on the podcast section for show notes, including the full transcript and links to any resources and information from today's episode. You can find and review us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to your podcasts. We are also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Daughterhood the Podcast. Leave me a message and let me know what issues you may be facing and would like to hear more about. Or even if you just want to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. Also, a very special thank you to Susan Rowe for our theme music, the instrumental version of her beautiful song Mama's Eyes from her album Lessons in Love. I hope you found what you were looking for today. Information, inspiration, or even just a little company. This is Roseanne Corcoran. I hope you'll join me next time in Daughterhood.